Big tech stocks leading market gains today, with the Nasdaq 100 officially wiping out year-to-date losses. The Magnificent Seven adding more than $800 billion in market value following the deal between the U.S. and China to temporarily reduce tariffs. Joining us now with more, Dan Ives, Wedbush Securities Global Head of Technology Research. Dan, great to have you as always. I know you say this truce is the best case scenario. Which tech stock is the biggest winner within that scenario?
I think it's Apple and Nvidia. I mean, if you look at this, that was the black cloud, right? I mean, the supply chain hearts and lungs are in China. And as much as you could talk about moving to India and others, this is a huge sigh of relief. And I think it changes our view that, new highs for tech, new highs for the market, now on the table after what we just view as a dream scenario happened this weekend.
Well, Dan, let's talk about Apple a little bit. I know you had a call for a $3,500 iPhone if production was brought back to the United States. What's your call on the price of an iPhone today?
And look, it comes down to I mean, they're going to have to struggle not to raise prices if they don't get exemptions and you actually keep some sort of tariff in when it comes to China. Look, it all comes down to the reality is iPhones need to be made in China. Some can be made in India. They can never really be made in the U.S. Because if you want them made in the U.S., the price points would basically be massive demand destruction on day one. And it would take 4 to 5 years to even build 10% of that in the U.S. So that's why our whole point over the last, 6 weeks was let's talk reality versus fairy tale. And the reality is that iPhones will continue to be built in China, with some being built in India.
How do you suss out the reality versus a negotiation, a framework, a thinking of a deal when there isn't necessarily clarity yet on the goal of these tariffs?
Look, I think ultimately they're both playing poker, and especially U.S., they look at their hand, it's not a good hand, right? And I think they had to move further and further back from the cliff in terms of what we saw with the delay of the reciprocal. And obviously when it came to China, because the cargo data doesn't lie and the price points doesn't lie. And whatever CEOs are saying publicly behind closed doors, what they're telling the White House is you need to change, you need to move. So our view is even when it comes to the 30%, I mean, that's probably the high bar. It goes to call it a reciprocal 15%, 20%. Once you work out WTO, IP, and all the other issues are going to have to get worked out over the next year. Mm-hmm. But you don't want a decoupling when it comes to AI revolution. And I think this was, a potential black swan moment that was self-created that's no longer there.
And Dan, my guest host Lou Bassanese has a question for you.
So Dan, I just want to talk to you more about Apple. I feel like early in the show I said this time of year everyone gets a bit negative on Apple. How worried are you about price sensitivity, right? I mean, the consumer is super loyal to Apple, 2.5 billion devices out there. You got a lot of subsidies. Does it really matter if the iPhone price is a little bit higher than it was expected? I mean, do you really think that impacts demand?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Look, I mean, the last thing Apple wants to do is raise prices. And they've kept prices basically the same. The reason that is because you have, call it 300 million iPhones that haven't upgraded in 4 years. So even if it's 3%, 4%, 5% of that may be delay for a year because of a $100 increase or $150. That's not what Apple wants, but they're beholden to their supply chain. But when it comes to going into WWDC and iPhone 17 and obviously AI, I mean, this is a key period for them to actually see growth in terms of high single-digit, double-digit growth, which was obviously evaded, in terms of the Apple story over the last few years.
Dan, one quick follow-up. Earlier in the show, I said the Mag 7 was a boy band like NSYNC that's breaking up. Who would be
and
your...
I love NSYNC.
Yeah, look, who would be your Justin Timberlake, though, for breakout? You said Apple and Nvidia. If you had to pick one for the best breakout for investors right now, which one are you most optimistic about on the aftermath of these trade truces?
If there was like a Timberlake part of NSYNC breaking out, it would have to be Nvidia. I mean, and look, Jensen, we'll see what happens with the black leather jacket if he had to make it to be a boy band. But look, I think the reality is that I think it makes all new all-time highs because there's only one chip in the world fueling the AI revolution, and that's led by Godfather of AI, Jensen Nvidia.
How big of a catalyst, Dan, is the fact that the United States is lifting some of these sanctions between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia when it comes to chip purchases? We're seeing the shares of Nvidia up over 5%.
It shows it's not just about China. I mean, think about it. That was not on the table when you look at that whole market. And it's not coincidental that they're in Saudi Arabia this week after, obviously, the U.S.-China, weekend talks with Besant. Because it shows, like, when you think about AI revolution, you only have 4% of U.S. enterprises going through AI, 0% in Europe, 0% in Asia outside China, and in Middle East, it's baby steps in terms of where we are today. So this just shows what I believe is going to be happening over the coming years. The trillions being spent on AI, and obviously it starts with chips, but think about on the software side, from Microsoft to Google, to Amazon, to obviously names like Palantir, which I kind of view as front and center the best pure play AI name out there.
Dan, let's talk about Microsoft since you mentioned it. A report from CNBC citing a spokesperson with the company that Microsoft is cutting 3% of its workforce. Any take on that?
I mean, I think they're just doing what they do every kind of few years. They're still hiring when it comes to direct sales. I think some of the strategic areas. But look, companies, and we've seen with a lot of big tech companies, they're going to have to continue to focus on strategic versus non-strategic. But right now, it's Microsoft's world, everyone else paying rent when it comes to what we're seeing on core cloud in terms of enterprises. So this is in no way any sort of sign of weakening. I mean, they just had a quarter. That was just a Saquon quarter they posted.
And I also, before we let you go, Dan, want to get your take on Tesla. We saw the share slumping a bit off the back of a fall in Chinese sales, but of course, back up today, perhaps off the back of images of Elon Musk and President Trump together in Riyadh, and also the broader market lifting. What's your take on Tesla?
But also remember, like, Musk is in Riyadh as CEO of Tesla, no longer in terms of my view with Doge, Trump administration. Remember, that dark chapter is over. Now it's about autonomous when it comes to Austin in June. I believe it's the next stage of this massive story for Tesla. And I think, look, they're going into a Jalen Brunson moment. I think it's just the start of what I see as just massive growth. And I think a $2 trillion market cap could potentially now be on the table for Tesla.
Really great overview, as always, Dan. It's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so
you.
much for making the time, and thanks to Lou for joining the conversation.